of you arrived and familiar faces. So we've got 3 talks on offer this evening, or this afternoon, and it's a great delight to welcome Professor Sally Brailsford to give the main keynote, if you like. I'm personally delighted to welcome Sally because Sally's been a huge influence on my own career. In fact, I first met Sally in October 1995. You can almost probably name the day. As a student, I was a student on the MSc at Southampton in OR, and Sally was one of the teachers and taught me. In fact, you taught me optimization and linear programming. Actually, it wasn't simulation. And then I did my project in healthcare at Southampton. I went away. I worked a couple of years myself as a management consultant, and I came back to Southampton to do my PhD. And Sally was then in the business school, and I must advise it was Arjun Shahani in mathematics. But anyhow, Sally's work with a colleague Ruth Davis was inspirational and really inspired me to think about studying healthcare processes. So it's largely thanks to Sally and to Arjun Shahani why I pursued a career as an academic. So thank you very much. And so Sally's going to, well, got an interesting background herself. She was a nurse. You also at one point was a Russian translator, is that right? You speak fluent Russian, do you still? I'm not sure if that's still the case. A mother to 3, a grandmother now, and 25 years or so of research in healthcare modelling, mostly, and well known worldwide as expert in simulation modelling in particular. And holds many different esteemed positions, and including being one of the vice presidents of EURO, which is the organisation of OR societies across Europe, and the head of the Rowse group, the OR Applied to Health Services, which is the annual conference we meet every year in a different European country, sometimes further away, which is a fantastic conference every summer. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Sally to give a talk about the Care Life Cycle Project. Thank you, Sally.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, for that very kind welcome, and thank you all for coming. Yes, I'm going to talk about a project that's underway at Southampton. It's been running for about 3 years now, or 3.5 years, where it's a 5-year programme. I'm going to talk about 3. I know it says 1 model. I'm actually going to give you 3 for the price of 1. I'm going to talk about 3 different models that are running as part of this big programme. I'm not going to go into a lot of technical detail. If you're interested in the technical detail, I'm happy to talk to you about that afterwards. And then I'll just finish off by talking about one of the key things about this particular project, which is working across disciplines. So this is one of 4 big projects that the EPSRC, the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, are funding under a programme called Complexity Science for the Real World. The others are not in healthcare, but they are in quite diverse areas, but ours is particularly focusing on the ageing population, and the principal investigator of our project is actually an expert in demography and is one of the world's leading experts in ageing. So there's 4 principal investigators from the 4 different disciplines that are involved in this. So we've got computer science, operational research, or management science, as we call it, because I'm in a business school. And also we've got people in gerontology and social policy. So it's a real mix. And so it's a big team. You can see there's several co-investigators and research fellows and PhD students as well. And we also have a program manager who keeps us all in control. So it involves a number of existing research centres at Southampton, including the Centre for Operational Research, Management Science and Information Systems, and our Centre for Research on Ageing and Centre for Population Change and so on. And as you can see, we work with a whole raft of external organisations, ranging from local people, the local hospital and our local Hampshire County Council, right through to the Department of Health and the NHS. So the kind of purpose of what we're doing is to apply ideas from complexity science, and one of the things we all had to learn was what is complexity science, which, as far as I can understand it, meant slightly different things to all the different people. But that rather than using the traditional methods that the social scientists had used for forecasting the future growth in the population and then the need that would entail in terms of the burden of disease and social demand for social care and so on, all these traditional methods were really reaching their limits. And so the idea behind the whole complexity science, or the complexity science in the real world, was to see whether you could apply some of these ideas from computer science to really tough societal challenges. So some of the other projects are looking at ecology and climate change and so on. And we were looking at the business between this macro to micro level. So we're not looking at massive models of the population where you just have a spreadsheet and you crunch the numbers. We're actually, to some extent, looking at individual people. So we're using new techniques like agent-based modelling in order to capture the individual level, and then to try and join them up and see what light that can shed. So the idea is to look at this sort of micro to macro gap in terms of modelling, to include uncertainty and variability, because the kind of models that are traditionally being used are deterministic, they're fixed, and they don't take account of individual variability. But then also to look at interesting things like spatial embedding and migration of population. The fact that I come from Southampton, where nearly all the people who work in the care homes are Polish or Eastern European, because we've got a very large population of immigrants from Eastern Europe. So what effect is that going to have? The workforce itself is ageing. And of course, the way that families are forming and unforming is changing. And so the way that the sort of traditional nuclear family where you cared for your parents and you didn't move far away from them has changed completely. So how are all these spatial changes going to affect who provides care for elderly people in the future? So, as I say, we're looking right from the individual level, the individual person, so it's actually modelling an individual person with specific needs and specific diseases or needs for social care. Then the sort of organisational issues, how many care home places do we need, how many residential care, how many other kinds of care should we provide, up to the population estimates, the kind of thing that the Department of Health needs in terms of workforce planning in the future. So I'm sure this graph is very familiar to you. It's the sort of baby boom problem, the fact that older people are not just the major consumers of health and social care, they're actually the major providers of social care. Informal care, that's care provided by families and friends, is by far the largest part of social care that's provided. And as people are themselves aging, of course, a 75-year-old today is probably going to be a lot healthier than a 75-year-old was 30 years ago, but they're going to live longer. So what is the implication of that in terms of the prevalence of disease and the burden for care and so on? So it's certainly a complex problem, and it certainly calls for complexity methods. And I think this is an amazing graph. This shows the world population, which since year zero, say there's the birth of Christ, it sort of trundled along pretty flat for about 1400 years, and then suddenly it just took off, and it looks exponential. I mean, we're now up to we just reached, I think it was last November or the November before, we reached the world's 7th billionth citizen, and it looks as if it's just shooting up. So there's obviously going to have to be some consequences of that, not just in the UK, but obviously in places like China, which is where one of the care life cycle PhD students is looking at this problem in China, which is a really interesting area. So what is complexity theory and what is systems thinking? I mean, I think they aren't really that new ideas. They're ideas that go back to the kind of Santa Fe Institute and the sort of modelling that was done in the 1980s and 1990s about these beautiful pictures that they produce. They're ideas that it's not about being complicated, it's about systems being unpredictable, so that if you've got a complex system, it can produce behaviour which emerges from the fact that the interrelationships between the different parts of the system. So each of the individuals in the system might actually be governed by fairly simple rules that are predictable and linear and understandable. But if you put them all together, if you put a whole population of people together who all behave in a fairly rational way, as a group, they may behave in an unexpected way. And so the idea behind, and there are lots of examples of this in computer science. The idea is that could you apply this to human systems? These ideas of actually the kind of modelling techniques that were used to look at these sorts of systems and produce these lovely graphs. Could you apply them to real world systems? So I say the idea of emergence. I mean, it's just a really simple example. That this is a termite, and a termite is programmed with incredibly simple rules in terms of how it should behave. I mean, there's different types of termite, and they have different types of behaviour. But basically, each one just responds to various pheromones in the each one secretes, and then that one says to the next one, if I put my grain of sand here, you put your grain of sand there. So they're really, really simple rules. And no termite, or there's no sort of architect termite that has in their mind this amazing structure of a termite's nest. This is the emergent result of the behaviour of a large number of individual termites who are all following these really simple results. If I do this, then you do that. So the idea is that there's a system property of the termite's nest which any individual termite has no conception of. It's almost in a different plane. And so the idea is, can we use ideas like this to actually look at sort of real life systems? So certainly one of the things we could have done was say, let's build a model of the whole health and social care system in the UK. And we decided that was quite a challenge and would probably take more than 5 years. But also it wasn't something that we really wanted to do. What we wanted to do was build a family of different models at these different levels, some individual levels, some at the societal level, and to try and link them together, and so that the models would talk to each other, but they wouldn't actually be part of one mega huge model, if you like. So this is just a list of some of the models that have been built or are in the process of being built. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but we've got a very good website. So if you are interested, please visit it. We've got a lot of publications up there now and working papers. And we've also got a lot of briefing papers, which are sort of one-side A4 sheets, which are written in plain English for a lay readership. So there's all sorts of things. I'm going to talk about these three particular models fairly briefly, without going into too much of the technical mathematical side underneath it. So the first one, I think this is a kind of underpinning model, because this model is going to inform lots of the other ones, and it's a real demographic model, but it's an agent-based model rather than a spreadsheet-type model. And what it's looking at is the way that partnerships and families form and dissolve over a long period, and what that means for in terms of social care. So, these are the sorts of questions that are puzzling healthcare planners. And say in today's society, where people get divorced and they move on, and there are complicated families with different sibling relationships. The question is, would you care for your ex-husband's mother-in-law when she's 85, and just because she happens to be living in the same town as you? Supposing you've grown up in a household where there were grandparents living with you, does that make you more or less likely to want to care for your own grandparents, and so on? So they say this is an agent-based model. So each of the objects in the model are individuals, and they kind of go through their life course, and they meet other people, and they marry them, or they partner with them. They may or may not have children. The children may or may not leave home. The partners may stay together, or they may not. The people can move, and so on. So what this model was was built to kind of replicate that population pyramid. It was a scaled version of the UK population. So excluding Wales, I believe, so it might just be England. So I think it's England and Northern Ireland for some reason. So that's why there's a sort of, yeah, but that's got Scotland, yes. Interesting. So I have no idea why Wales isn't on that.
Wales is there, so there's not many people in it.
That's probably what it is. So I mean, if each of those dots is a person who represents some scaled thing, and so you can see on the right-hand side where you can't read it, but that is the sort of biography of an agent. So you can actually look through the kind of life history of this person who, in 1972, agent number 500 and something, age 18, marries agent something, age 21, and they move out to set up their own home, and so on. So basically, we actually start this model running at about 1800, and then we let it run through until we get to the year 2000, where we check it with the actual known data from 2000, and then we run it forward to 2050 and do all sorts of experiments, which we're really looking at. In this case, we're looking for what would happen in terms of informal care. So we made a lot of assumptions in this model, as one does in any model, about the amount of available time people had for actually giving care, and who would do this. And we assumed that nobody had to care for their children, which was a bit unrealistic. But as I say, you can tweak these various parameters in the model. But one of the key findings was the importance of informal care and what would happen if informal carers were no longer able to actually provide care, and the state had to step in and provide it. And then we looked at once you've got the model, of course, you can start playing what if. So you can say, supposing the divorce rate changes, or supposing people have less children, or they have more children, what happens? And not just these things that you might not be able to influence, but are there any levers that government could influence by changing the tax rate or something to try and encourage people to get married rather than live together, or whatever it is. So we did this, and we, for instance, looked at the effect of increasing divorce rates, but actually it was surprisingly stable to the increase in divorce rates. So it didn't really seem to, for a sort of plausible assumptions about whether people would continue to care for their ex-in-laws, didn't seem to make any difference. And then, what happens if more older people move back with their children? I think actually it's the other way around these days. It seems to be the younger people moving in back with their parents. But anyway, again, the effect is fairly small, actually. Even if you increase the chance that older people do live with their adult children, it would have a beneficial effect, but it's not really going to solve the problem. So it looks as if the kind of things that government could do are not really going to have, are only going to have marginal effects compared with these really strong processes that are just going on in society, the sort of trends in demography. So again, this is ongoing work. They are now trying to include all sorts of different parameters to make the models more realistic and so on. But there's an awful lot you can do with an agent-based model. You can capture these behavioural things which you couldn't do in a sort of spreadsheet type model. So that was one model. That model is built basically by the computer scientists who are really interested in just kind of playing with it. I come at this problem as an operational researcher, thinking, what is the problem in the world, and how can we use modelling to actually help with the problem? So here we're working with Hampshire County Council, who we've worked with for many years. We've had many master's students who've worked there and PhD students. And in fact, Paul was involved in co-supervising one of them. So this is with Kevin Andrews and Rachel Dittrick, who are based at Hampshire County Council. And this was looking really at now we're not looking at the UK as a whole, we're looking specifically at Hampshire. and we're looking at how people move between the different types of funding, and again how change to the population in Hampshire might affect the amount of care that Hampshire is able to provide and fund. So similar sort of things by looking at the different sources of funding, whether it's sources of care, whether it's from informal care or whether it's from the voluntary sector, private care or state funded. I mean, it's an interesting area because I came originally, as Paul said, originally working in healthcare entirely, and I only started to work in social care applications about 7 or 8 years ago. And there isn't such a big literature, there isn't such a big tradition of using modelling in social care as there is in healthcare, though there are, so there's some models that consultancy firms have used. In this particular model, we used a modelling approach called system dynamics, which is an approach which doesn't look at individuals. So whereas the agent-based model looked at individual people, this model treats people as stuff, if you like water flowing through tanks. So you have people who are receiving care from Hampshire. They are just a sort of mass of people. So we're not looking at the individuals in that system, we're just looking at them as a volume of demand, if you like. So this particular model was looking at, so people entered our model when they reached the age of 65, and they flowed through these different kinds of receipt for care, depending, of course most people age 65 don't need care, they're fit and well and they're able to look after themselves. They may be providing care themselves for other people, but they don't actually need it. So this is a really sort of a high-level overview. So in the blue box at the left, we've got our healthy and fit and independent people, irrespective of what age they are. And then maybe something happens and they move into the orange box. So maybe they have a fall or they have a stroke or something happens and they need some kind of social support. And then there are 3 different ways they could get it, from the local authority, from their family and friends, or from a mixture. And of course sometimes they go into hospital, and this is where it gets really interesting, is the relationship between the health and the social care system. And this particular model doesn't go into that in great detail, unlike the third model, which I'll show. This particular model just, say, looks at a fairly high level at the flows between, in and out, between the NHS side and the social care side. So behind that big model there's a lot more detail. So basically underpinning this there are a lot of equations which govern the rates at which people move, and of course all this comes from data which is local to Hampshire. Wherever Hampshire were unable to provide us specific data, we were able to use sources from the literature, or actually from our own resource, from our own projects ongoing in the care life cycle. So there's all sorts of different kinds of data went into this model, ranging from UK data and local data. There's a very useful study, the English longitudinal study of ageing, which provided a lot of the transitions between stages and so on. And we looked at the different categories of care need, which I think are not specific to Hampshire. I think they're universal. So one of the interesting things for me as an operational researcher was that working with social scientists, they had access to things, or they knew about studies that were not really on my radar. So we were able to actually find some of this data because we were working across disciplines that we might have struggled to get hold of quite so easily. I think one of the interesting experiments we were able to do with this model was to look at this issue about how willing people were to care for, or would be in the future, to care for or provide any kind of support for their elderly family or friends. So we had this parameter called willingness and resources, which encompassed a whole lot of things. I mean, it encompassed not just were people willing to do it, but were they financially in a position to? I mean, if you're working full time and you have to give up work to care for your elderly parents, then that would affect your pension, and you might not be able to do it anyway. So it's not purely a case of were people actually wanting to, it was were they in the financial position to do so. And that's just a completely impossible and unmeasurable parameter, because you're talking about people's feelings and you're trying to predict how people might behave in 10 years' time. And it's really interesting, and so here's where working with people in social science, we're able to, in fact, one of the PhD students associated with this project in social science is doing a PhD which is looking at the sort of discussions and the way that families negotiate providing care when an elderly parent starts to need. So, as I said, there's all these other factors that come into that decision. So it's a really difficult parameter to actually quantify. But what you can do in the model is just play around with it. So you can say, okay, we might never actually know its true value, and it might vary from place to place. It might be different in London to it is in Cardiff. But we can play with it and see what the implications of that would be. So if we say it's 0, that means there's no care at all, or family are completely unable to provide it. And when it's 1, that means that the family can provide everything and the state doesn't need to get involved. So I say this PhD student, her work is suggesting it's about 0.4, but I mean that's very, she's doing a qualitative in-depth study of a relatively small number of people. But so the interesting thing that comes out from this model is not so much the numbers, because the numbers are obviously wrong. They are, they're based on something that's not really measurable. But what is interesting is there seems to be some kind of tipping point effect, in that that where those lines are clustered together, that's where the willingness and resources is 1 or 0.8 or 0.6. So it doesn't really matter. This, you can guess what it is, and it doesn't really matter whether your guess is wrong if you're close to the top level. But once you start getting down to 0.4 or 0.2 or even 0, then it suddenly drops away. So if there is going to be this change in future, that families and friends will not be willing or capable to provide care, then this has massive implications for Hampshire and all local authorities. So even though this is a model that doesn't actually necessarily represent a true value of something, it allows you to understand what's going on, and it shows you what the implications are. So that what this model says is that informal carers really matter, and it's really important that although Hampshire can't predict what this will be, they do need to put in place support systems to support families. So this is obviously going to be a big problem in future as the population ages. So again, that's just another example of a use of a model for understanding what's going on in the system and giving Hampshire some insights into the kind of support systems they should be putting in place. The third model I'll talk about a little bit longer, because this is a very interesting model for a number of reasons. It's for a particular disease, which I shall refer to as AMD, because age-related macular degeneration is a bit of a mouthful. And it's a hybrid model, which means it uses several different modelling techniques. So what is age-related macular degeneration? It's a very, very common cause of blindness in older people. And what it causes is a loss of the central vision, the part of the sort of the site where you focus. So you can see the sort of periphery, but you can't recognise faces. You can't watch television. You can't read. You obviously can't drive. And but really, it just comes with age, unfortunately. And until quite recently, there was nothing that could be done about it. So if you got this this wet form, there's two forms, wet and dry, and if you got the wet form, then basically you were told to sort of go away. We're very sorry. There's nothing we can do for you. You'll gradually lose your sight, and of course that has big implications for the kind of social care that you're going to need. So how this project started was that we have worked with our local hospital on a number of projects, and they're beginning to have a big problem because there is now a treatment available, which is great news if you're a patient, but it requires monthly injections into the eye, which are pretty revolting. And it does mean that instead of people just going away and not coming back, we've now got more and more people coming back every month to have these injections, and they have to be done in a clinical setting. They can't be done at a GP practice. They have to be done in a hospital by a trained person. And so this was putting a great demand on the clinics. And so, I mean, we were approached by the hospital. In fact, we were approached by the eye department, who said, can you help us build a model to show us how we can organise our clinics better so we can deal with this large volume of additional patients. And it wasn't just that they had more now. Of course, because this is a disease of older people, they were expecting more and more to start coming through. And as people lived longer with the disease, there were more people needing it. So we thought this was an absolutely brilliant problem for us. It was a very, very complex problem because it involved interaction between the health and social care systems. The kind of issues that we're having was that if you miss an appointment, you can miss one, but if you miss 2 or 3, then your sight starts, you start to actually lose your sight. So it's really important that people attend regularly. But if they don't have good social care support, it's difficult for them to get to the hospital. And what the clinics were finding was that there was such congestion and queues and long waits in the clinic that often people who were coming on hospital transport had to leave without being seen because their transport had arrived to take them home before they'd even got through. So this was a problem where ostensibly the problem was with the NHS, because if they were able to provide an extra 20 clinics a week, they could treat everybody. But the long-term benefits would be felt in the social care system and the in Southampton City Council and who were the ones who would incur the costs of providing the social care for these people if they went blind. So you could say, well, surely can't they just get together and negotiate some sort of joint funding to see, this is a whole systems problem, but it's really political, as I'm sure you can imagine. And so it seemed a perfect way of building a model in a computer that you could play with, and you could experiment with things without actually having to try things for real. And you could explore how these trade-offs could be made. And so the people from the council could sit round with the people from the hospital, and they could actually discuss different strategies for working together. So I say we had 3 different models. We had one model of the eye clinic, which was an individual level model, which just showed people coming in and queuing and being seen, having the different treatments, seeing the nurse, having the injections, having various other eye tests done, and so on in the clinic. Then there was a model of the actual disease itself. So if somebody missed an appointment, then there was a probability that their eye disease would get worse. And then we had the whole thing was embedded in an agent-based model of the whole population. So this was a geographical, spatial model showing where people were situated around the hospital, showing the effects of people that had to travel in by different ways. So as I say, the idea was just to have a synthetic, risk-free environment that people could play around with things, experiment with having different numbers of staff in the clinic, running more clinics per week, and so on, to look at these trade-offs and just to get people to start talking to each other across these 2 systems to try and break down some of the silo mentality, which is again another very powerful use of modelling, because it enables you to to actually sit round a table and talk about things and understand things from the other perspective. So it's the sort of systems approach coming in, understanding how things connect. So while it was a very nice problem because it linked the health and social care system, it was also good for us because we needed different disciplines to build it. So I won't go into too much detail about this, but rather similar to the other one, we needed the social statisticians and demographers for some of the data. We needed programming advice to help us with the software, which was not the easiest. And we also needed the OR people who had the sort of problem solving and the pragmatic approach to solving things. So I won't worry too much, I won't bore you with that. This is the main view. We use this software which allows you to do modelling in these three different modelling approaches, and produced all these lovely graphs. On the left is a representation of the agents, the people agents, with the hospital somewhere in the middle there. That's what they look like, and the pink and the blue are male and female, very stereotypical. We had we had a clinical model in there of the different progression stages of AMD, and we had a social care model in the agents, which were using these categories of critical, moderate, and the rest of it, and a person's receipt of social care influenced the chance of them making an appointment. So a person who had a great need for social care but didn't receive it was less likely to turn up than somebody who was very well looked after by their family and whose family would take them to the hospital for their appointment. That was the clinic. Again, it was a very typical of its kind of model. When this runs, you can see the patients coming in and you can see them moving around. The ophthalmologist said, please can I have a copy of this model running, this video of the model running, so I can show my boss to point out that I really do need more clinics. So I'm sure that's a very typical response when people see these things. It's a very powerful communication, really, to see the clinic working and see, yes, it really is like that on a Monday morning. So we did some experiments looking at supposing the NHS does one intervention, supposing local authority does one intervention, they provide more social care, they provide more transport. Supposing the NHS buys some expensive camera that can process people more quickly, and so on. And you can get all sorts of results about how many people miss their appointments, how many people receive their injections, and for the different scenarios. Again, this is very typical of this sort of modelling. And you can look at the impact on the total amount of sight lost in the population compared with one of the other, with the different settings. But what we're in the process of doing at the moment is collecting data. We're actually, in a couple of weeks' time, we're actually going to go into the hospital and observe this clinic, and we're administering a questionnaire to the patients, asking them how they got to hospital, and did they, what would happen if they weren't able to come by that way, and how did their sight affect their ability to do activities of daily living, like cooking and so on. So it's taken a long time to actually get that far to collect the data. So there are a lot of technical challenges in this kind of model. So you've got lots of things going on different timescales. You've got a disease that evolves over years. You've got a hospital outpatient clinic that runs in minutes, runs for 4 hours or so, and so on. So there were a lot of technical challenges in this model as well. But I think the most, as I said, the most interesting thing was that we used different modelling approaches from an academic point of view. That we used different modelling approaches for the different bits of the model that were the right tool for modelling that particular thing. But that, as I said, that then enables us to go and show this model and run it with the kind of domain experts that know the real system. Yeah, okay. So we actually presented this work at the House of Lords almost a year ago, about over a year ago now, which was very scary. It was the most scary presentation I've ever done in my life. And but it actually stimulated a lot of use, a lot of interest from various people, and we are, as I say, in the ongoing process of collecting data. So just quickly, I'll just okay, no. I think just briefly, just talking about working with different disciplines. I mean, so I've worked in healthcare for, I dread to think how many years, healthcare modelling, and pretty much every project I've done has involved working either with a clinician or a hospital manager or somebody from the real world that understands the system. And I think this particular project has been even more challenging. We've been working with other academic disciplines, and we all think we know what we mean by things. We all think we know what we mean by a model, but actually that's turned out to be something quite different. And I think for the researchers and the postdocs, it's been fantastic fun learning a bit about other people's disciplines, but it's also been quite a challenge because you can't be an expert in demography and statistics and operational research and computer science. You've got to have one thing. So actually juggling that and deciding which conferences you go to has been quite a challenge. But I think it's this sort of, I think it was very brave of the EPSRC to fund a project like this, which is very adventurous, and I think it's by working across the boundaries of different disciplines that we're really going to make exciting progress. So it's been one of the most exciting projects I've worked on, and I think all these models show we probably couldn't have built any one of them but in one discipline. You had to have this sort of cross-fertilisation of ideas across the disciplines that made it possible. That's the team. And just to thank you very much. I hope we've got a little bit of time for questions, but thank you for listening.
Yes, thanks, Sally. Fantastic. So time for questions. You want to start off? Silence. Yes, Alex.
Yeah, Alex Ansey from Narrow 11 Health Board. I was just interested in this concept of multiple models and how they communicate with each other. Can you just elaborate a little bit on how so models within an area looking at different aspects of it? How do you actually get them to communicate in a realistic way with each other?
I mean, there's different levels at which they can do that. I mean, the last model, there were 3 models that were actually all in the same software environment. So they actually pass data to each other, the different models, inside the same program. So you just click run, and the whole thing runs sort of seamlessly. Whereas some of the other models, the output from one model then has to be fed manually into another model. So, for instance, that linked lives model, which is quite an abstract model, but that tells you things about, for instance, that willingness and resources parameter, or the divorce rate, or the receipt of social care in 20 years' time. So those numbers would be output from one model and passed to the next one through an Excel spreadsheet, for example, technically, but I mean not actually within the model. So they are separate models. They just have an interface between them in terms of the output from one becomes the input for the next. So there's technical challenges there for the computer scientists as to how you do that in a sensible way.
I just went back.
John Watkins, Public Health. I was interested in starting talking about the thing on the complex system involved with their conditions and their sort of model. I was just wondering, I mean, we've seen from the financial markets models have been in sort of different places. I was just wondering, have you got a plan to sort of take what you've done the sort of predicted changes that they will actually find the model from real world. And so you're going to predict the trajectory in any one of the projects that talks about, and you say, well, actually, this change was this and then you can do some sensitivity analysis and then offer that with data effects for the model.
No, but we certainly have, that's one of the beauties of a 5-year project, is that certainly some of the Hampshire data, for instance, has come online since we started the work. And the other thing that we've had is early access to some census data through the Centre for Population Change. They've got some research arrangement with the ONS, so we have to some extent. I mean, it's quite. I think these models where you're looking at a 50-year timescale, you do wonder how can you validate something where you're actually looking at. Yeah, I mean that. Certainly that, if you like, the more traditional OR type modelling, where you're working on a much smaller timescale and you're looking at optimising the use of resources over, a weekly clinic period or something. I think there's less complexity there. I think where the true complexity arises is where you are actually trying to plan further out, and so you are. I think personally, I'm not sure that you can actually validate such models in the statistical sense of validating. All you can do is look at the individual logic of the relationships that you've modelled and say, is this plausible? So these, there's a nice example about marriage. There's a demographic paper by somebody called Bellari. There's a wedding ring model, and essentially what they did was, it's an agent-based model where they said, what is a plausible reason for people to get married at a certain age, and who do they marry? And so they programmed those into the agents, and then they compared the outputs of that model with statistical data on marriage. And so I think you can do that sort of thing. And certainly with the linked lives model, that is what we've done. We've calibrated it so that we get to the year 2000, and that the population profile looks reasonably like what it was then. But I think when you're going any further out, I think it's the insights that you get more than statistical validity, really.
Sort of almost a bit both with one question about animal skins, public health ways. But for example, the ones you were talking about at the end, possible real-world changes to the clinic or social care, and you were making a prediction that we get lots of benefits with openness to that. But don't you think that there's some basis for validation there, even if the tools for doing so rigorously is still possible? That if any of those changes don't come to pass, and seeing that you want those.
Exactly. And I think, yeah.
Sort of planned into the 5-year project.
Yeah, and I think looking at scenarios and saying which of the, we obviously, there are things that we don't know about the way that human behaviour will change in the next 20 years, but can we look at which particular policies are most robust to a whole range of different assumptions about the way the divorce rate changes and that sort of thing. So I think that can be a powerful use of modelling, even if you're not sure which of those scenarios is actually going to be the real one.
But I mean, focus on that one where, say, big issues, big added on camera and things like that. You know that obviously you've got always the issue that other things may get changed around it. But if the argument is always going to be that things better than what we're going to use. So I assume that you go back and look and see, is introducing that camera mover have sort of effect? So I suppose that kind of even when, like you say, so
Yeah. I mean, I think that sort of validation is obviously because that can be done in a time scale that you can observe. You can test. You can do the intervention, and then you can look at what happened and is it what the model said would happen. In terms of that narrow, in terms of the performance of the clinic, did it reduce the queuing time? Did it increase the number of people? That sort of level. But how that plays out in terms of savings in the community in 25 years' time is more challenging, I think.
Yes.
Different perspective, if I may. I'm wondering whether you've got anything out of this which tells you whether there's anything else going on other than just a whole lots of people making individual decisions. And I'm reminded of two pieces of work in other fields. Ken Lark's work that he published as The Waves of Time on long-term historical change, where he put forward as a non-specialist seems to be a very convincing argument, but there's nothing really going on here other than a lot of individual decisions you build up very long time chain. And then there's parallel work happened in with ecology, with plant assemblages, where there were all these theories about these different planets and such, and then another bunch of analysis came through again, the same conclusion. There's nothing happening here other than lots of points which happen to have these different appearances. I mean, is your work reinforcing that sort of insight, or are you seeing something different in what you're doing?
I mean, I think certainly in terms of the agent modelling, you are trying to see whether you can program individuals to by rules which seem plausible, but then produce sort of global behaviour in the system which is measurable and corresponds to observed data. So, but yeah, I mean, obviously you don't know for any individual. They don't. However, an individual decides to seek social care or marry somebody, whatever it is, you can't actually program that. But can you find algorithms or rules that are sufficiently good over a population level, so that they do actually produce at an aggregated level a behaviour or an observable outcome in the population, which corresponds to historical data. So, I think there are, behavioural economics. I mean, there are all sorts of examples of this being applied to that kind of system where you can, because I think if you can reproduce the observable behaviour at an aggregate sort of grossed up level, when you're looking at hundreds of thousands of individuals, then you can then start to explore different policy options, even if you don't, you can't actually, you are talking, at the end of the day, you're talking about human beings that are not behaving in a sort of a rational way, but at an aggregate level, you can, you can capture that overall behaviour of the system.
Okay, I think to keep schedule, we'll draw that to close, and we thank Sally again for a great talk. Thank you. Okay. Okay, so we now have two shorter talks, more local talks from two of our PhD students who are both coming to near the end of their PhDs. And the first one is Angelico Fetta, who's going to talk about social network analysis.
Okay, hello there, I'm Angelico, and I'm going to be talking about predicting adolescent social networks with social network analysis. So, just to start off then, that's not working, maybe we'll go with that. Okay, so there's been quite a bit of research in recent years about the effect of social networks. A study into happiness and our social networks was conducted, and it was found that you tend to be happier if your friends are happy people. so that's possibly a bit of life advice. There's been studies into obesity, and there's a great paper called My Friends Are Making Me Fat, which looks at how obesity can actually spread through a social network. And on a more serious note, there's also been quite a bit of research into adolescent suicide, which found that actually an individual or an adolescent is twice as likely to commit suicide if a friend has committed suicide. So there's quite a lot of interesting health-related work linked to these social networks. So our research looks at, in particular, adolescent offline social networks. So that's individuals not on Facebook or Twitter, but that is real-world data about individuals you connect with or our adolescents connect with on a day-to-day basis. And we were interested in looking at particular structures present in the data and also to try and further understand factors important in adolescent social network evolution. And that was our sort of key focus. So to illustrate this, here we have a real social network from a school in Bristol at a certain time point. And what you can see is our red dots are smokers, purple dots are non-smokers, and the arrows between people are the friendship connections. So if we look at this school a year later, and what you can see is the social network has completely changed, and actually there's been quite a jump in the number of smokers. So we were interested in seeing, okay, well, can we see something in the pattern of the social networks that might illuminate this, reasons into this a little bit more. So let's just flash forward another year, and you can see the network has completely changed again, and what you're actually seeing is almost towards the bottom of this network, you see a little cluster of smokers appearing. So what factors are important in this evolution, and can we use simulation and social network analysis to try and understand this a little bit further? So the data that we have for this study, it was from a Stop Smoking in Schools trial, which is a peer-led intervention study that was conducted in 52 schools across the South Wales and West of England region. So what we had was 18 schools worth of social network data, and within each of these schools we had 12 control schools and 6 intervention schools. And I'll talk about what the intervention was in a second. So within each of these schools, we had individuals' personal attributes, so their age, gender, etc., etc. We had details relating to their smoking behaviour, so how much they smoked on average, and also we had details regarding their social networks as well. So the intervention itself, the way it was conducted was the focus was on the individual or highly nominated individuals in the network. So what they did was they selected people who were supposedly had high status or respected individuals in the network. So this could be leaders in sports or just people or individuals that the adolescents actually looked up to. So these individuals were selected, or the top 17.5% of individuals in each school were selected to go on some training, given some information about the dangers of smoking, and given some informal training on how to intervene in a smoking-related situation. So they would actually, when they saw someone smoking, they would go and speak to them and say, oh, well, smoking's really bad for you, give some information about it. And that's what this intervention did. And so it's a longitudinal study, so we have data at 3 separate waves after that. And we also had data on who the nominated individuals were as well, so we could look into those as well. So as I said, so we've got 4 waves of smoking data collection, so that's 3 waves after the intervention and 1 wave at baseline, and we have 3 waves of social network data. So unfortunately, they didn't collect social network data at baseline, so we can only see what sort of happened after the intervention. So the way we went about looking at this was we wanted to use simulation techniques to try and understand these adolescent social network and their evolution. So the idea is you take a social network from our data, you put it into a simulation, and you predict how it's going to look at a later point in time. And we would compare that with the real data. Now, this kind of prediction of links is a well-defined problem in the literature called the link prediction problem. And you may have encountered link prediction algorithms yourselves in your everyday life. So, for example, if you're on an online social network, They often suggest people you may know. So here are my Facebook recommendations and my LinkedIn recommendations of people I might know or might wish to connect to. So that's an example of a link prediction algorithm. Or a slightly more obscure use of a link prediction algorithm, or the ideas of link prediction algorithms, is a recommendation system. So that might be something like your shopping habits on Amazon. So these are my shopping habits. So this is what Amazon thinks that I should be purchasing. So they want me to buy chocolate. My windscreen wipers broke a few months ago, so they want me to buy some new windscreen wipers. And because I was a very studious PhD student, they also want to give me lots of social network books as well. So, so how did this work? So our ideas were to build this simulation framework in something called AnyLogic, a software package called AnyLogic, which uses Java. It works with an access database, so you can actually put any social network data into it and predict then to a future time step. So we're working towards making this generic, so you can use it with any sort of social network data. And the method it goes about predicting is, so at a certain time point, an individual in my social network will decide, right, I want to make a change to my friendship connections. So they will scour the rest of the network, testing people to see if making a connection with another individual will actually increase their personal utility or increase something in them, basically, which is decided by the link prediction algorithm. But I'll get back to that in a second. So when they find the link that is most beneficial to them, they make that connection, or if they can't find a link that is beneficial to them, then they actually break connections. And this process evolves until we get our prediction out at the end. So we tested quite a few different methods of actually predicting this. So the first one was completely at random, where individuals could just select their friendship connection at random. There was nothing really intelligent about that. There was also the Adamic-Adar method, which looked at closing triangles in relationships. So a friend of a friend becomes a friend. We looked at the CATS method, which tried to shorten the overall path length of the network, so bring everyone a lot closer together, and see if that was effective in predictions. We also looked at something called a stochastic actor method, which is a statistical method on predicting the evolution of networks. So we tested that out as well. We then also tested PageRank, which is the method that Google actually uses to rank its web pages. So we incorporated that in, and what Google actually does is calculate some sort of metric for each web page on the internet and ranks them essentially by their status in the internet. So we had this sort of ranking of status in our social networks. So the idea was our individual who wanted to make a change would link to the individual of most status in the network. But then we had a little bit of a think about it, and actually, rather than linking to the individual of the most status, what would happen if we linked to the individual who would give us our own improved status in the network? So this was a new method that we came up with to test out. So the other methods are well defined in the literature. Okay, and the idea was you take our real prediction network, you put it into the simulation, and you get a prediction for time 2 and test it against the real data to see how effective that prediction was. And similarly, time 2 to time 3 as well. So some results then. So what you can see is a graph of each of our algorithms and how they performed in terms of improvement over random. Now you might not be able to read that because it's come out quite small, but basically the green bar is our PageRank max prediction. So that was the new algorithm that we actually developed, which looked at optimizing the status of an individual's social network. And what you can see is that actually predicts 40% more accurately the links between individuals than predicting completely at random. And what you can see is it also predicts a lot better than the other methods as well. So that was in control schools. This other graph looks at intervention schools. And what you can see, the same sort of behaviors occurring. Again, our PageRank Max is the most successful, but not as successful as in control schools. So this highlighted potentially a nice, interesting difference between control schools and intervention schools. Now, quite what that is we're a bit unclear onto that, really, because the social network statistics calculated on both these two networks of data or the school's worth of data for control and intervention schools didn't actually highlight any differences. So that's another interesting point here, how simulation has actually identified some difference that normal social network statistics couldn't identify. So that's sort of a nice little outcome as well. And again, in our predictions at time 3, the same sort of behaviour occurred there again. Okay, so those were our link predictions and our simulations. So what we wanted to try and do was actually try and make our link predictions better. And the way we went about doing this was actually including some information about the individuals in the prediction methods. So at the moment, all these link prediction algorithms only use information relating to the individual's social network. We don't know actually anything about them. We don't know what they like, what they don't like. And similarity is said to be a key factor in friendship selection as well. So we wanted to try and include some behavioural data about our individuals too. So this just gives you a little snapshot of the kind of data that we had. We had a lot of variables in terms of, this is just a little snapshot of it, but we had a lot of data relating to questions regarding their smoking behaviour, what they like to do, our individual likes to do outside of school, and all this kind of stuff. So we needed to try and identify things that could be important in the evolution process. But actually, what we decided to do was something a little bit different, which I'll explain to you now. So if we have an individual in our study, they responded to the questions in a certain way. So for example, our first digit here, our number 1, could relate to that individual's sex. The second figure could relate to their gender, etc., etc. So what we did was we amalgamated all the responses from each individual into sort of one string, almost like a DNA string, in how they responded to the questionnaire. So what we did then is we did this for all the individuals, and then what we can do is actually compare our DNA string with something called the Levenshtein distance, which is the number of single character edits required to assess a difference in our participants. So what you can see here is in our first 2 agents, okay, so they differ on the 3rd digit and the 6th digit, so their Levenshtein distance is 2, so they're 2 away in terms of similarity. So we went about putting that, along with our social network data, into our simulation, and we needed to go and change our algorithm to predict then to the next time step, because to account for this additional data that we were including. So we looked at our PageRank max only, because that was the algorithm that was most successful previously. So now agents could link in terms of status or centrality as before. They could also actually change their behavior to match another individual, or link in terms of similarity as well. Or, as I said there, they could change their behavior and link as well. So, how did this turn out? Well, what you can see here is the percentage improvement over our PageRank max algorithm. And you can see that in the 4 schools we tested this on, it increased statistically significantly, but actually not massively, but I'm still taking it, so it's fine. So it roughly increased about 1% in each of the schools we tested. But interestingly, at time 3 predictions, in some schools it actually decreased, which potentially suggests that sort of similarity and friendship is important in the initial stages, or the younger adolescents, but as they grow older, perhaps similarity isn't as important. But again, that's quite a broad generalization to make, considering we've only tested this on 4 networks. But the ideas are there, and the potential is there as well. So our conclusions of this research, well, it identified that the PageRank max is the most effective in predicting adolescent social networks of the methods we actually investigated. Predictions can be improved with elements of behavior, but it also set out the creation of a framework to predict behaviors as well, and to predict links in a sort of simulation method, which hadn't been achieved in the literature previously. It also identified this role of eigencentrality or status in our adolescent social networks, which I think is one of the sort of key outcomes of this research as well. So given that, we actually went back and looked at data from the ASSIST trial. Now, what they found was that the intervention was successful in the initial stages of the trial, but actually, as it went on, that effectiveness seemed to decrease. And they were unsure quite why that was. They had some theories, but they weren't really too sure. So what I did is I looked at the eigencentrality or status, which is the metric that I was using for my link prediction algorithm, of the nominated peer supporters. So even though we did only have six schools of intervention data, the nomination process was actually conducted across all the schools, so we could see the nominated individuals in control schools as well. So what this graph actually shows is the percentage of individuals who were eigencentral and nominated peer supporters. So essentially, if 10 individuals were chosen to be nominated peer supporters, I took the top 10 eigencentral individuals and tested the overlap, or had a look at how much overlap there was. So you can see that, so at the very top here, there we go. So at the very top here, you can see that there's sort of a 60% overlap in our schools. So then I looked at the difference from time 1 to time 3. And what you can see is the actual eigencentrality, or those individuals who are nominated eigencentral, actually decrease. So the eigencentrality of these nominated individuals decreases over time. So perhaps that could be important in diffusing the intervention as well. So that's something that we sort of relayed back to the group that gave us the data. So that's pretty much it from me. So that was investigating adolescent social networks with social network analysis. Thank you.
Great. We have time for a few questions. I'm sure you'll stay around afterwards if people want to ask more. But do we have any?
One quick clarification. Yes. On your very last slide, what you didn't say is whether there was any, whether it was which ones of these had actually lost centrality. Was there any pattern of the ones that had or haven't lost centrality?
We didn't look into too much detail in terms of the centrality. This was something that sort of high.
Overall, they tended to.
Overall, they tended to. Yeah.
Good questions. Yes.
Was that using all of the high status individuals, not just the ones that have been chosen to promote health and behaviour? Because I would imagine it's quite unusual to not be a risk taker for an adolescent. So you're giving high status people something that that's good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wouldn't that actually change their status, or are you just saying that everybody's, because of the change of the network, everybody's status is going to change every time? That's one key thing anyway, that everyone's status does change over time, or at least it is extremely variable. So when building the sort of intervention, that wasn't something that was really considered previously, that they sort of assumed that we take these nominated individuals and they would be effective over the course of the intervention. So now that they are actually going to be conducting this study again in Scotland. They're piloting it in a number of different schools, so they're actually looking at potentially reselecting as the years go on to select new nominated individuals. But yeah, did have a little bit of a look into the individuals who were selected to be nominated supporters, and their eigencentrality does decrease more rapidly than perhaps in the control schools. So yes, it is quite uncool to be these sort of peer supporters, so you're kind of giving them a bit of a poisoned chalice, I guess, which is rather unfortunate. But, but yeah.
Last question, guys.
During the students of the distance similarity scores, do you think one way to some of the importance of the show? Because obviously you said people share the same gender, but there might be some more rare traits which would say they're more similar.
Yeah, we didn't specifically weight them. It is sort of a direction for future research, is that there's loads of data there, but it's all very specific data. I mean, there's 4 or 5 different questions about smoking behaviour to sort of verify if the adolescents were actually given the correct smoking data. So that sort of needs to be filtered out as well. But it was more kind of a sort of a method that can be used and refined sort of at a later date.
Okay, great. Good, thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. Angelico has his Bible on Thursday. I suspect there'll be more questions on that.
Yeah.
A bit longer than that. Okay, so our final speaker is Lizzie Rowse. Liz is funded by Cardiff and Bell and doing operating bits. Not yet.
All right, so thank you. Yeah, I'm Lizzie. I'm doing my PhD in theatre scheduling, and I'm in my 3rd year now, so not quite as close as Angelico to finishing, but it will be soon. How do I change this? Oh, right.
Is left and right working on the You good?
Yeah, okay, thank you. All right, so let's get into it. Just a quick background about me. Before I did my PhD, I came to Cardiff to do my master's. I'm sure you might have heard it from Julie, trying to advertise it. But as part of my MSc dissertation, I worked with the district nursing service, looking at kind of the best team skill mix that they should have to kind of match their skills to the demand. So I kind of worked on that out in the community. But now for my PhD, I've come back into the hospital, looking at how to schedule the theatres, but really kind of looking at the impact that it has on the beds, on the wards. You know, you can't look at it in isolation. You need to think how it will affect different departments. So, as Paul said, I'm sponsored by the Cardiff and Vale Hospital, University Hospital Board, and I have quite a large supervisory team. I've got 4 in the university, and then Tony Turley and Andrew Nelson up at UHW, but it's good fun. So, as I'm sure you'll all know, all coming from healthcare, there is a problem in the UK with the amount of operations that are being cancelled across the UK, not just in Wales. But a significant proportion are cancelled because of the lack of beds. So, you know, people come into hospital, they need a bed possibly a day or 2 before their operation. They'll have their operation and then come back and need a bed for however many days in order to recover. The issue is that bed isn't available for post-surgery, post-operative recovery, so they just can't get them in to have the operation, so things get cancelled. Looking at UHW data that I was given, in the past kind of tax year, about 18% of operations were cancelled that had been scheduled on the list. So what happens is people will, like 3 weeks in advance of their operation, be sent a letter, say this is your date, you're coming in for your operation. Then closer to the time, then they're actually scheduled onto the theatre lists, actually said this day and this time. So once they're actually on the list, then 18% are cancelled. So it's a big, you know, I'm coming into hospital, I'm really built up for it, but then at the last minute, they're cancelled. So it's not pleasant for staff and patients, so it needs to be sorted out. Of those cancellations then, 27% were due to the lack of beds, and this is up at UHW, so I'm not sure about the whole UK, but this is at UHW. Not to be really down and depressive, but I'm sure you all know as well, the Royal College of Surgeons had a big report out last year, back in April, just saying that things are quite bad to do with cancellations, but things are happening, there's an action plan in place, so we're all going to get there. So, how am I going to help solve it? So the aim is to schedule operating rooms in a fair way such that demand for beds on wards is levelled throughout the week. So I'll just quickly talk about key things within that aim. So I'm going to create a schedule. I'm going to say which specialty is in which theatre during which session, so morning and afternoon. It's going to be cyclic, so it's going to be the same week after week. Staff know where they are, you know, that kind of thing. The operating rooms, so I'm talking to managers and stuff up at the hospital. They say that the operating theatre isn't actually the bottleneck. It's a very valuable resource, but that's not really where things are kind of going wrong. It's the pre and post-op recovery that things are going wrong. The theatre is there and it can be used. So I need to take into account any rules that restrict any specialties from using certain operating theatres, and they will be built into my scheduling tool. Fair. We need to make sure all the specialties have enough lists. We can't give them all to our favourite specialty and leave the little specialties out. You need to be fair. I'll touch on this towards the end of the presentation, but it'll be to do with waiting lists, trying to kind of get waiting lists down for a particularly high demand specialty, and then maybe next quarter or whatever, give them back to other ones that didn't need it this quarter. So demand, this is, the operating rooms are a driver of demand for other departments in the hospital, you know, lots of clinics for recovery and stuff, and the beds on the wards, which is where I'm concentrating. So I need to look at the length of stay, how long people are going to be in the beds, you know, and then get out. And also levelled, no peaks in demand. So I would like a constant use of beds. I don't want on a Monday morning everyone being put in a bed, and then Friday afternoon kind of being empty. It needs to be constant in order to, you know, be efficient. So looking into the literature, and I'm sure this happens in every hospital in the UK, there are 3 different stages of scheduling. So the first one is called case mix planning, and that's when you say, right, I've got so many OR theatres, I then have so many hours that are available to me. How do I split these hours between my specialties? You know, I'm not being specific and saying where you will be in which theatre, it's just how many sessions or how many lists you will have in a week. Then knowing that, that's fed into what's called a master surgery schedule, and this is the cyclic weekly timetable, and this is now going to specify, right, cardiac, you're going to be in that theatre on these days at these times. Then, once you know that, when and where you're operating, you need to know who you're operating on and in which order. So this is more detailed, knowing what patients you've got and in which order to operate on them. So they're all done in at different time levels. The first one is probably annual decisions, the other one 6 monthly, and then the other one, well, that's every day, or for every theatre list you would do that. So I'm focusing on the middle one at the moment, the weekly timetable, and this is what the presentation will be about. So this is an example of the UHW master surgery schedule at the moment. It's literally just saying which specialty is in which theatre at what session. Common constraints are thinking about staff availability. You know, they often at clinic one day, may not do it this day. Objectives then often is to minimise cost, of course, that's the NHS's aim. Maximise volume of patients, get people through off the waiting lists. And also utilisation, you know, it is a valuable resource, so you do need to use that as much as you can. So my scheduling model, it's split into 2 really. First, you optimise a schedule, so you'll find a good schedule. And then you feed that into a simulation to kind of test how good it is. So within my optimization, I've got 2 types of constraints, an operating room constraint and a bed constraint. So the OR constraints, they're to do with your operating theatres. I've just realised I keep calling them operating theatres or ORs, but they are the same thing, operating rooms or operating theatres. But yeah, I need to make sure you're allowed to be in that theatre. You know, is it medically safe? Do you have the equipment? and also I can only have one specialty in one room at one time, just common sense things like that. And then my bed constraints, I obviously can't, well, this is all to do with predicting, so I can't have more patients in the ward as the number of beds. You know, that's the number of beds is my constraint. So that's going to be in my optimization. Then with this schedule, I'm going to simulate it. So by that I mean simulate patients coming in, having an operation, and then staying in a bed for so many days. So this is just kind of test how good it is. Especially, I'm trying to see how robust it is. This is kind of my aim at the moment, to create a robust schedule. And it will give confidence to the hospital managers, the staff, you know, knowing that this timetable will stay constant week after week, and it will cope. The beds on the wards, they'll cope. You know, you won't have an excess demand one week and not the next. So, slightly touching on the maths, but I won't do it for too long, I won't scare you off. First, what I do is I get a list of scheduling rules from the hospital. So this is things like, are you allowed in theatre for or not? Is there any particular day you can't do because of a clinic? That kind of thing. So I get these rules, and then I generate all possible schedules, all different combinations of this room, that session, thousands of schedules I generate, taking into consideration those rules. Then, with those possible schedules, predict the bed occupancy for the next X days, and then in my optimization, I will select a subset of those possible schedules to kind of make my schedule the best schedule. So this is my maths, the model, very briefly. I'm going to minimize the cost of the chosen schedule, and to me, my cost is the difference between the number of beds you have and the number of beds you're actually going to use. So we're trying to minimize the kind of empty beds, if you think of it like that. These are my OR constraints, so only one specialty in each OR, taking in consideration of all of those rules. You can't exceed the number of beds on the wards, you can't have someone on the floor and not in a bed, that kind of thing. And select schedule or not, it's literally a tap or a switch. You turn it on or you turn it off. You select the schedule or you're not. So, very briefly. But of course, in real life, it is more complicated. I won't get into that. I can answer any questions afterwards if you would like to. Just to kind of see this better in your minds, and I definitely work better with pictures. The A matrix in my model up at the top left. These are my OR constraints. So each column is a possible schedule for one specialty. So a 1 indicates if they are going to be scheduled in this theatre at this session, and a 0 if not. So I create so many thousands of possible schedules. I've got a subset of each for each specialty. The top yellow bits, that's just indicating we just need one schedule for each specialty. You know, they can't have two. That doesn't make sense. And then each subsequent white row, that's looking across all the specialties. You can only have one specialty or one in each row in order to say you can only have one specialty in this OR. So thousands of columns. The optimization will pick out a subset of the columns to say this person is in this OR at this time, and that's that. So using that matrix then, knowing when people are going to be in theatre or have their operating time, I will then simulate kind of the people coming through in for the operation. So I might have 5 people come in for their operation during this one session on a Monday, say. Then I know on a Monday in ward 1 I'll have 5 people, and then Tuesday I'll have 4, perhaps one would have gone home. So I kind of simulate it. I kind of predict the bed occupancy based on my schedule that I created in the first matrix. So along each row then, that's a ward on a day, and that's got to satisfy my constraints. I can't have any more patients than beds. So that's what I'm trying to do really. In terms of the robustness of the optimization, two kind of things to consider really. What does a hospital consider a robust schedule to be? You know, not thinking mathematically or anything, you just need it to be good and reliable. You need it to kind of withstand the fluctuations in demand, that kind of thing, and not put pressure or excessive pressure on your wards. Mathematically though, what a robust schedule is, it does guard against the uncertainty of this uncertain data. And the uncertain data is your predicted bed occupancy. You just don't know how many people will be on a bed next Tuesday. So what this method does is it kind of steps back a bit and takes a compromised schedule. So, okay, we're willing to give a bit on the cost, but in exchange for a better, more robust and reliable schedule, being able to handle the slight variations in your bed occupancy. So it's kind of trade-off that I'm investigating with at the moment. So initial results really. These are initial ways of filling in my bed matrix or predicting bed occupancy. So the first one, I could give every patient the same length of stay and they can have an average length of stay. So everyone comes in on Monday and everyone leaves on a Thursday if we had 4 days length of stay. The next one, I say, okay, I know the length of stay distribution as observed from previous data. I then, for each person in the bed on the Monday, I'm going to sample or select when you're going to go home based on this distribution. So it might be the case that the average length of stay is 4 days, but some people might leave on day 3 or they might stay for a week. It just depends, and this method kind of takes into account that. Thirdly then, I've got the expected bed count, and that is using the distribution. It's predicting your it's not the average, it's just slightly different. This is important in the robust one because you can't anticipate exactly how many people you'll have. Then the last one, I've got multiple scenarios. So number 2, that's one scenario, that's one possible bed occupancy. But then now I'm going to say, okay, this is 1, this is 2, all going to consider that at once. So kind of robust. So just looking at the results that I found, if you consider the A matrix only, so don't take into account the bed constraints, it's very easy. You'll find thousands of solutions, thousands of schedules, just because it's an easy problem. That's not constraining. The operating theatres aren't the constraint, it's the beds on the wards, and this is showing it. The average length of stay then, can't find a feasible solution, you just can't find a schedule, because everyone comes in at the same time, everyone leaves at the same time. There's no leeway with some people leaving and then there's room for other people to come in. It's all in and out. There's no budging. The single scenario, when you just kind of sample from the length of stay distribution, that is a feasible solution, and there's thousands of them again. Same with the expected bed count. However, the multiple scenarios, I'm doing that at the moment. You know, how many scenarios can I have until it breaks? That kind of thing. But working on that at the moment. So, hope you can see this. Mainly focus on the colours. The top one is the current MSS used at UHW at the moment. And the bottom one is an optimal one that I found through my scheduling tool. Again, it's just an example of an optimal one. There are lots whenever you press this and press run. You'll notice that some things have been grouped together. So renal and theatre 3, it was on a Monday and then a Wednesday, but this schedule seems to think that having them on a Monday and Tuesday is better. Possibly to do with the length of stay, getting people in sooner before the weekend kind of thing. So yeah, this is just an example of an optimal one. So my mathematical model thinks it's the best schedule, but then I simulated it. I simulated people coming in, staying for different amounts of time, and out of 1,000 simulations, 82% of them just broke. It couldn't cope with the patient numbers and the bed constraints. So even though it's an optimal schedule, it's not necessarily a good one, because I've shown that in 82% of the times, it wouldn't have worked. You know, you'd had to cancel someone to have their operation. So this whole idea of good and what that means, this is really interesting. So just looking a bit deeper, where does it break down? I've looked at, on the x-axis, all the different wards in the hospital. And this is the number of kind of excess patients, more patients than beds. And you can see on Ward 1, definitely on a Monday, you've got 2 extra people, which doesn't sound that much, but that is what's causing the problem. And there's a slight problem on Friday. But Ward 1 I know to be the paediatric ward. So any specialty that operates on children, those children then have to go to the paediatrics ward. So if you have lots of paediatric specialties scheduled same time, different theatres, you know, that's okay if on the schedule they're all satisfied, but then they've all got to funnel their patients into the same wards. That's the bottleneck, and that is where it's breaking down. So you need to think, right, if they're going all to the same wards, can I then move my paediatric specialties to kind of stagger their arrival into the ward? So this is the crux of it, really. This is future work then. I'm going to go up a level of my scheduling stages, and I'm going to say how many sessions each specialty requires. So cardiac might have 10 a week, and ENT might have 4, but you know that might change depending on demand, depending on the waiting lists and the predicted activity. So yes, this is ongoing work, and it will be input for my master surgery schedule. So eventually I'll put both together, things will flow through, and then we'll get the best schedule in the world. Thank you.
Very grand claim. Okay, we're nearly on time, but do feel free. If you need to leave, do feel free. But any questions for Lizzie? Yes, Danny.
No, absolutely. I assume that this is predicated on the fact that all your elective beds are going fenced. Because what you find actually is the night before, all your beds are filled up with urgent cases that turned up at A&E last night, no matter how good your scheduling was.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So this is all for elective surgeries.
But nobody else can use those beds.
No.
Because otherwise you can just use those spots, isn't it?
Yeah. So I've got data from the hospital on how many physical beds there are, but I will take away some for emergencies and just keep mine for electives. Yeah.
Questions? Yeah.
Hi. Obviously, 2 primary constraints are your capacity in the ward and capacity in the theatre. What do you think will happen to your model when you've got the elephant in the room, which is funding to establish, because obviously this is all predicated on limited funding, isn't it?
Yeah.
What do you think will happen until that?
Well, I've taken the operating theatres as a given, that they're there and they will be staffed. At the start, I had issues with kind of taking in staff constraints as well. But so as soon as you build them in, you'll just end up with the schedule you've got now. So in terms of funding and staffing, I've taken that just as a given. In terms of the funding for the beds, I might play around with the number of beds available. You know, on some wards, do you need more beds? Can you take that away from another ward to give them? But yeah, I'm sure the price will increase as soon as you take into account funding.
Yes.
When you're predicting length of stay, are you using calculated actual data, or are you looking around to see whether there are best in class?
Actual data. So literally kind of looking at the past year's data and sampling, just plucking out numbers from that.
Are you basing it on day surgery admission or day before surgery?
I'm not sure. I think it's...
You do both,
yeah, so I can change, I can do it day off surgery, or I can bring them in a day or a day 2 days before. It's all flexible.
The tool's fairly generic, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it can be you just tweak to local thing. At the moment, you parameterize it with the data. It reflects people coming in a day early or whatever on the day, but you could change that. Like you can change the number of beds available that are ring-fenced for electives. Yeah.
Types of beds that are available, often the people that are cancelled and can be sickest patients, and they can't be done until they need some high care. So if you've got a different from the sort of people, you can make a statement.
Not at the moment, but because it is so flexible, instead of having whole wards and their beds, I could split that ward into high dependency or whatever different types of beds. I could do that. And I have critical care, yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
It sounds really quite flexible. So is there any plan to try it out with maybe fewer or to get that agreement?
No. No, but because I am sponsored by Cardiff and Vale, then the hope is that I can create a tool and they can use it, test it out maybe, with a small subset, but then see how that goes. And
we did have a Shine Award Health Foundation proposal in to do this, to follow on. Unfortunately, it wasn't quite funded. We got to the last stage, but wasn't funded. So that was the plan for that, was to actually pilot this. So now we're nearly at the end now, where you actually have a tool which could be a generic tool which could be used anywhere. To actually now try it in anger, and actually make some changes. So we still hope to do that with Cardiff and Vale, or maybe a 9 Bevan. But we would love to carry it on. Obviously, it's silly to leave it now. I think last question, in the interest of time.
Within that model, I was wondering, you've got the time periods for the operation theatres. Obviously, number of patients, any type of, say, orthopaedic can do X number of patients in a number of hours. But that varies depending on the patient and when they go in to do surgery, which also then impacts on beds as well. Is that built into the model in terms of, so if they're planning to do 6 patients in a day, but they only get to do 4 because of the seriousness, say patient 3.
Yeah.
Is that built in? So then you've got 2 available beds.
Yeah. Well, the way I've worked out how many people are operated on, I've looked at the length of the operation and divided that into the session length. I thought that was better than looking at observed planned, because that's not actually what would have happened. But in my model, the people who come in are operated, like all of them are operated on. There's no one gets lost.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Lizzie, again. Thank you. Okay, just to finish off very quickly then, I've got a few notices here. Correct me, Julie, if I'm wrong. So I've got training courses. So the 9 Bevan team have been running some training courses. You would have seen that in your email, hopefully. So there was one indeed today. The next one's on Excel modelling on the 17th of June. So introduction to Excel modelling. And there's an introduction to modelling itself on July the 3rd. It's got here almost fully booked, but a few spaces still left. Okay, so that's could be of interest. So if you're interested, come and see us afterwards, or you'll send out some details, Julie, is that right? And then there's also other courses coming up, possibly on Excel and essential statistics being planned for the autumn. Okay. In fact, you've run 7 Excel courses to date, and you have 1 today. Yeah. We've got the next developing mathematical model seminar. This will be probably October or November. So watch this space. We'll obviously email out a main list to let you know when the next one will be, but it'll now be after the summer break. Pencord, Daniel here is from Pencord, but again, that was in the email, I think, but they're running a similar training course event on June the 17th down in Exeter. So if you're interested in that one, 18th of June, okay. If you're interested in that one, catch Daniel or speak to us afterwards, and the space is down there as well. Again, sort of introduction to modelling kind of idea again, is it? Then?
It's a general launch event for the entire training programme. So,
great.
You're more than welcome to send away to international events. So, you'll say about training, learn how to do.
Great. So there's lots of opportunities going on locally for training. That's the whole thing. One of the things that came out of the whole the relationship we have with the health boards locally is not just to work on projects, but actually to develop these training materials to get these tools embedded with, and used by people in the health service. So they're being rolled out. So watch the space. And finally, then feedback. You've had sheets handed round. If you don't get a chance to do it now, there will be an online version sent with you can capture it online, which will be really helpful for us to get some feedback. And this is now our 4th event, so just for how to pitch future ones in terms of what you would like and how they would run. So that's it, I think. I'm not missing anything, Julie.
No,
Tell me otherwise. Great. Okay, otherwise, thank you once again for all giving up the last 2 hours. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.